We're waiting.
So I know a lot of people have been waiting for this one of like the comparison of 3080 versus 6850 on the ROG Ally. So when I originally set out to make this video, I was going to make it all in one big video and going to kind of get all my ideas all in one video. But it quickly became a multi-video idea, or not idea, but like just in terms of length, like it kind of had to be. Otherwise it would have been like a 40-50 minute long video, I think, at best. So with that being said, we'll start off with the performance of the 6850 versus the 3080. However, I will note that there is a bug going on with the 6850, but it does not seem to be affecting me in the way that it does affect others, and I'll talk about that more in the end and why it's kind of relevant. But to start off, so for my performance testing, all my testing was done with core isolation turned off. There was no, I was using display driver uninstaller or DDU in between each GPU run, so, or not, yeah, it was each run. So I didn't do it, run the game running both GPUs simultaneously or one after the other. I ran all the games on the 3080 and then I ran all the games on the 6850, and I had done all this in the past as well. Like I had the data from a month and a half ago, and just because of all the updates and drivers and everything like that, I just said, okay, we'll retest everything. So that's how I've been testing everything. All of the graphics settings have been listed on the charts and everything when I'm showing the charts and the gameplay footage. The gameplay footage in the background will have the frame rate averages in certain games. So you'll see the numbers at the top, like in the RTSS readout. So you'll see the number furthest to the left, not close to any numbers on the right. That's the actual FPS readout number. The three numbers after that is the FPS average, the 1% low, and then the 0.1% low. So that's just kind of explaining like the background footage and how the performance charts are looking and what to expect with that. So with all that being said, pay attention as well to the frame times. I've highlighted it in key, or not highlighted it, but kind of like blew up the RTSS frame time readout. That's the line that goes up and down. So that's the consistency of the frames delivered in milliseconds. So it'll show like 0 to like honestly to like 100, 200 milliseconds. But if you're getting like 200 milliseconds of delay, that's a whole different story. But anyway, so generally it's going to be operating between 0 to about 40-ish milliseconds on a good day, typically a lot lower in high frame rate scenarios. The higher that your frame rate is, obviously the higher that the frames are being delivered, so your frame time would be lower. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of like on that frame time graph there. So for certain games with Tomb Raider, Dying Light, Red Dead Redemption 2, they have long like spots of like blank or like nothing and just a black screen. So that will affect the overall benchmark if you're using RTSS and doing the FPS averages of the 1% lows and 0.1% lows. That's how I get all my data. I don't necessarily use the in-game benchmark. However, for games like Dying Light 2 and Tomb Raider, I just show the overall FPS average, not the 1% low and 0.1% low, because there's in the Dying Light 2 benchmark at least, and to some degree the Tomb Raider benchmark, there isn't a long enough sequence of like solid data. So there, like it goes from like one scene quickly and then black screen for a good second or two into another scene. So that will just mess with the averages. So for those games, I just showed the FPS average that the game benchmark spat out. So that's when you'll be seeing that. As well, for Red Dead Redemption 2, I used the final benchmark sequence part where he's robbing the bank or robbing the store, then gets in the horse chase. So that's just kind of like my whole preamble of the charts and everything that you're going to expect to see in the performance. I'm trying not to drag this out. I just want to make sure that everything's kind of clear as to how I came to my results and how I've compared the two graphics cards with one another. So you will see performance differences, and I'll talk about ease of use and like time with each, things like that, and I'll speak to the driver issue and highlight the driver issue at the end of the video, but now we'll be getting into the performance. Okay, so kicking things off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, 1080p Ultra preset, FSR, DLSS set to quality for both respectively the 3080 and the 6850. So we can see that the overall FPS averages between the two was 5.9% difference favoring the 3080. The 1% lows and 0.1% lows were fairly in line with one another. The 0.1% lows were 1 FPS better on the 6850. Now moving over to 1440p, that's where we see the overall FPS average difference getting higher, and we can see that we're getting a 16.9% difference between the FPS averages of the 3080 and 6850. However, the 0.1% lows and 1% lows were very well in line with each other. The 0.1% lows for the 6850 were 3 FPS lower though, but they were still very solid in my opinion, and that these frame rates with the either experience at these settings were both playable in my opinion at 1440p. Now moving over to 4K, they're still playable. We're still getting 60 FPS, and surprisingly on the 6850 we got a 6.3% increase on the overall FPS average, and then the 1% low was 2 FPS higher, the 0.1% low was 2 FPS higher as well. So this is like at the bare minimum of 60 FPS playability. So you want your 60 FPS average, and then you'll want at minimum your 1% lows dropping down to 30, so you're not falling below 30 FPS. Otherwise then it becomes really juddery and just not a good experience. Keep in mind this is at 4K running on the ROG Ally with the XG mobiles attached at ultra preset qualities. A little bit of FSR, a little bit of DLSS set in there, but this is damn good performance at 4K in my opinion. But the really sweet spot would be honestly 1440p, maybe dial back some of the settings, throw FSR, DLSS to balanced if you wanted 1440p high refresh rate. At 1080p you're going to be getting that ultra preset at FSR DLSS quality, and honestly I would wager a guess that you could just turn that straight off and have a native 1080p. I didn't do that just for the sake of parity of having DLSS and FSR running for all the tests. Now moving on to Cyberpunk, this is where there's going to be a lot more tests. So it's going to go to 1080p, 1440p, 4K like in Call of Duty, but we're going to be doing 1080p, no RT, 1080p with RT, 1440p, no RT with RT, and so on. So we can see here with Cyberpunk 2077, Ultra preset, no RT, no upscaling, because I thought that this was kind of reasonable for the cards. So 1080p, straight, just kind of powerhouse, like max settings. Let's see what pure GPU power can do with this game. And we can see here that there was an 8.8% difference in the FPS averages from the 3080 to the 6850. The 1% lows were significantly lower as well on the 6850. However, both settings, both games were playable in my opinion. However, you would get the smoother experience on the 3080, it seems. Keep in mind that this is just my little custom benchmark run. I basically recreated the in-game benchmark as best as I could up until you get to the street. I was playing as the street kid starting, so this is that little starting kind of sequence that you play out, and I've just been reloading that save and doing the tests over and over. So now at 1080p introducing RT low, so that's, I believe, just local shadows, so it's really not that much. We can see here that there was a 10.8% difference in the FPS averages from the 6850 to the 3080. However, we can see here that the 1% lows and 0.1% lows were significantly higher on the 3080, more so with the 0.1% lows, but even still with the 1% lows. However, I would still consider this to be somewhat playable. And again, sorry, this is with FSR and DLSS on balance now because we're engaging that ray tracing. So now 1080p RT medium, FSR DLSS balanced, 52 versus 40, 26.1%. The 1% lows and 0.1% lows were a lot better on this run on the 1080p RT medium. However, they still were lower than the 3080, although the 0.1% low was only 1% off, even though we were 26% off on the FPS averages. Now moving to RT Ultra, 1080p, we got a 41% difference from 47 to 31, and the FPS averages for the 1% low and 0.1% low, they were honestly pretty similar. Like, yes, they were higher on the 6850, but the differences weren't that great. Like, they're about they were kind of in line. So 1440p Ultra, no RT, no upscaling again. Again, we're just doing pure kind of GPU power on this one, like for like, with no ray tracing to favor, obviously, the NVIDIA. So 56 FPS average versus a 50 FPS average on the 3080 and the 6850. However, this is where we're seeing a 45.7% decrease in 1% low going from the 3080 to the 6850. Now, this is where it's dropping into the danger zone of playability. Mind you, these aren't hitting 60 FPS averages anyway, so I would probably kick up a little bit of upscaling, maybe set it to quality, and you would have a good visual and good performance experience. But again, I just wanted to do straight GPU power. So we can see again with that 45% difference with the 1% lows. Now moving to RT low, FSR balance, again, all the same settings. We can see that we're getting a 55.5% difference on the 1% lows and a 49.1% difference on the FPS average. Moving to 1440p RT medium, we are getting a 63.1 FPS average difference from the overall FPS averages. And at this point, I didn't bother comparing the 1% and 0.1% lows because it's just kind of in the territory of absolute non-playability, in my opinion. At this rate, if I was introducing ray tracing medium, I would probably go down to DLSS balanced, in my opinion, and I would even try it with the 6850. Now going to 1440p RT Ultra, we are getting kind of similar, like not too far off experience, surprisingly, from RT Ultra to RT Medium for the 3080, at least in the FPS averages. But anyway, so we did see a 76.9% decrease from the FPS average going from the 3080 to the 6850. Again, that's to be expected with the NVIDIA ray tracing advantage. Again, I didn't compare the 1% or 0.1% lows because it's just not playable at that, in my opinion. So now 4K Ultra, no ray tracing, no upscaling. This is where things kind of get impressive for both GPUs, in my opinion. So we can see that we're just barely touching 30 FPS average with the 3080, with the 1% lows actually being pretty tight for the overall FPS average. They're not drastically low. However, you'll see that with the 6850, we're seeing a 74.2% decrease from 1% low to 1% low on the 3080 to the 6850. We're only seeing an 18.8% decrease from the FPS averages. So this is where you're going to be getting into issues with the 6850. By no means are either of these cards billed as or meant to be 4K cards, in my opinion. The 3080 is probably closer to being a 4K card just because of the VRAM advantage. We have 12 gigabytes versus 16 gigabytes on the 6850 and the 3080 respectively. So you'll be seeing these bottlenecks in 4K in high GPU scenarios, high GPU demand scenarios. So now 4K RT low, we can actually see that we're getting better performance on the 3080 with RT enabled at DLSS balanced. So, and the 1% lows and 0.1% lows were, again, fairly tight for the overall FPS average. So I would maybe entertain the idea of playing 4K with DLSS on performance, RT low, RT medium maybe, at a 30 FPS lock. I would not hope for anything over that with the 3080. But now we can see here with the 6850 that yes, we're getting a pretty like high-ish for the card FPS average for ray tracing and 4K, even though there is FSR. But although it's a 34% difference between the two, again, we're seeing those 1% and 0.1% lows just being drastically hit. And again, that's due to the VRAM limitations. Now going to 4K medium RT, DLSS balanced, we can see here that we're getting 27 FPS. So you could tweak some settings and keep the ray tracing on, maybe turn some textures down, stuff like that, crowd density, whatever, and get that overall FPS average up if you were really shooting for a 4K RT medium or RT ultra. 3080 experience, but honestly, I would cut it at 1440p. Anyway, so seeing the difference between the FPS averages, 34.7%, 27 to 19 overall FPS average, but we're seeing here that the 0.1% lows and 1% lows were actually a little bit tighter this time around. And now back to 4K Ultra, we can see that honestly, the FPS average from the 3080 from both was neck and neck. It was 27, but the FPS 1% and 0.1% lows were lower. Anyway, so we can see that there was a 51.1% difference between the 27 and 16 FPS average there for the 3080 and the 6850. Now, finally moving away from Cyberpunk, getting into Dirt 5. Dirt 5 has a wonderful built-in benchmark. It gives you the 1% lows, 0.1% lows, spits out all the information you could ever want right at the end there. So it's beautiful. Anyway, so this is the result pulled right from that. This is at ultra preset with ray tracing shadows turned on, no upscaling. So this is 100% render resolution. So with the 3080, we're getting 84 versus 45 FPS, so 61.4% FPS average. And at this point, we're not really stretching the legs of the 3080, or honestly, if ray tracing wasn't enabled, the 6850 as well, in my opinion. But now we can see here that moving to 1440p, that yes, we're basically just being limited by the GPU at this point, because we're not seeing a massive we're not being limited by the GPU, sorry, we're being limited by the CPU, but because we're not seeing a massive performance difference between 1440p and 1080p. But now we're going to 4K. Now when we're really taxing the GPU, that's when we're seeing the actual decrease in FPS on the 3080. And we're seeing actually the same FPS on the 6850. So with this, it's a case of the ray tracing. It's a case of having not upscaling. There is ways to get better performance on the 6850. You can absolutely have ray tracing enabled on Dirt 5, dial back your settings to medium or high, do a little bit of upscaling, 1440p, 1080p, no problem. 4K, you could probably get away with it too at 60 FPS. There is ways around it, but I just wanted to basically crank up the settings and see like for like what's going to happen. Now going to Dying Light 2, this is where, again, I spoke in the intro of how there's the blank spaces, so I wasn't able to measure the 1% lows and 0.1% lows in this scenario. So if you'll see, the purple is RT off and the orange is RT on. So for 1080p, Ultra, FSR, DLSS set to balance respectively. So we can see that with the 3080 and the 6850 at 1080p, there was only a 0.5% difference. But then obviously with the ray tracing turned on, we were seeing 79 versus 60 or 27.6 FPS difference. But we were still getting a 60 FPS average on the 6850 at 1080p. So that was still playable, or is still playable in my opinion. Now going to 1440p, that's when we can see things are really kind of tanking on the 6850. We can see that the 3080 is just kind of laughing all day at 1440p, which is a 13.8% increase going from 6850 to 3080. And then with ray tracing turned on, there's a 60.9% increase going from the 6850. Now going to 4K, we can see that even at 4K, no ray tracing, the 3080 is still pretty darn playable, well above 60. It's 11.9% difference to the 6850. However, the 6850 is still nothing to scoff at because we're still getting above 60 FPS at 4K with this card, which is surprising with the VRAM limitations and with Dying Light 2 being a relatively recent release game that's still pretty demanding. Then turning on ray tracing, we can see here that 42.4 versus 29.3. I mean, if you're going for a 30 FPS lock on either, you might be able to get away with it, or a 30 FPS cap. I don't think it would be locked at all the time on 6850, and honestly, the 3080 might not be locked at all times on that either. But with the benchmarks, these are the results that I've been getting. So now with Forza Horizon 5, we can see that 1080p, ultra preset, FSR, DLSS set to quality. We got a 89 versus 86 or 3.4% increase FPS average on the 6850 versus the 3080. So I think this is like the first kind of win in the direction of 6850. And then we get an 18.1% increase on the 1% lows and 62.6% increase on the 0.1% lows. So that's quite significant. Those 0.1% lows are going to be those moments of like little stuttering and extreme slowdowns that you're going to feel for like little mere seconds. Now going to 1440p, we can see that there's only a 4.8% increase in favor of the 3080 this time. However, we can see that there's a 14.1 decrease of the 0.1% lows versus the 6850 in comparison to the 3080. Now going over to 4K, we are getting a 70 versus 4080. So this is where you're hitting the VRAM limitation on the 6850, even with FSR kicked onto quality. We're getting a 37.2% FPS decrease. And then on the 1% lows, 0.1% low, sorry, we're getting a 43 versus 19, or an 81.69% decrease. Now going to Gears 5, this one is typically an AMD favored game or benchmark, and honestly it's a pretty VRAM heavy benchmark as well when you crank up the settings to ultra. So keeping the settings at high, we're still kind of taxing the GPU, but it's not just straight hammering the GPU, and we're not just being GPU bound all the time. So you're going to be getting that high refresh at 1080p, so you're getting a 9% increase on the 3080 over the 6850, a 27.7 increase and 1% lows on the 6850, and 133% increase on the 0.1% lows on the 6850 versus the 3080. Now, keep in mind, if I haven't mentioned it already, with my benchmarks, I always run one benchmark or a cold benchmark, and then I'll run the actual benchmark or recorded benchmark after for each game, each run, each GPU, whatever. That's how I've always done it, because it always seems to avoid any sort of shader caching or mishaps that might not happen otherwise in regular gameplay situations. I find this is more so on the Unreal Engine games, so Gears 5, Wonderlands, Borderlands, things like that. Anyway, so going on to Gears 5, 1440p, we can see there was only a 1.1% increase from going from 6850 to 3080. However, we can see that 0.1% low, even though the 1% lows were fairly well in line with each other, there was a 107.6% decrease going from the 6850 to 3080. So again, that's the moments of stutter and stuff that you would be seeing. Now going to 4K, same thing, 96.5% decrease in 0.1% lows going from the 6850 to 3080. However, the overall 1% lows were higher than the 6850 on the 3080. And then comparing the FPS averages, we're getting a 16.7% difference between the 3080 and 6850. Again, this would be when you're kind of hitting into the VRAM limitations of the 6850. Now going into Hogwarts Legacy, this is my custom run from the candy shop to like the start of the bridge in Hogsmeade. Honestly, this isn't going to really test the GPUs all that much. This is going to be a test of the CPU really, and that's going to be kind of one of the points of one of my video, is that the ROG Ally is a massive bottleneck for some games, even when you're paired up with the 3080 or the 6850, and honestly presumably with the 4090, if without frame generation on the 4090 to alleviate any sort of CPU bound scenarios. Anyway, so getting into Hogwarts Legacy, 1080p high FSR DLSS quality, no ray tracing whatsoever on this one. Didn't want anyone to think about it. So we got a 27.4% increase on 1% lows from the 6850 to 3080. Again, this was the same quick save, reloaded, and then ran the same run. I did the run once and then recorded the second run, did the run once at the 6850, recorded the second one. Anyway, so we can see the 0.1% lows were fairly well in line with each other though, and the overall FPS average was pretty well the same, 54 versus 55. Moving to 1440p, we can see there was only a 5.7% difference between the FPS averages on the 3080 and the 6850, and then the 0.1% lows were not really that far off, as well as the 1% lows. They were a little bit worse on the 6850, but not drastically so. Now going to 4K, this is where we can see the GPU actually has a chance to like stretch its legs and kind of show that it can do 4K in certain scenarios, or at least be capable, because we're not really seeing too much of an FPS drop. We're dropping from 54 to 49 on the FPS average from 3080. However, those 1% lows and 0.1% lows are pretty abysmal in both cases. But again, we are still highly CPU limited in this scenario, but we still saw a 36.1% difference between the 3080 and the 6850. Now going on to Jedi Survivor, same thing. This doesn't have a built-in benchmark, so this is just my my custom run, quick save from the Mantis at, I can't remember this planet in town, but running through to the next meditation point and then reloading my save, doing that thing all over again. So for this, we can see 3080, 6850, and then I did 3080, 6850 with no upscaling. So that's no FSR because no FSR and no DLSS because DLSS was recently added into Jedi Survivor, which I also had to throw out my old test results for because I only had FSR. So now we can see testing 3080, 6850 with FSR, DLSS set to balanced. They're fairly well in line. That's the top two results. Honestly, again, this is going to be a test of the CPU because this is a highly CPU bound game. We can see here that with no upscaling on the 3080 we're basically identical results, and then no upscaling on the 6850 actually saw us drop like by 42.2% there on the FPS average from with and without FSR set to balanced. Don't know what happened there. I restarted the game, restarted the system, set the wattage, like made sure wattages were correct and everything, and yeah, that was just my result with that. So moving to 1440p, I didn't do no upscaling. I just did upscaling FSR, DLSS balance for these ones. Saw a 6.5% difference for the FPS averages, and the 1% lows was 55.5% difference. Going to 4K, we saw 59.4 difference from the FPS average down to the 6850, 26 and 4080 on the 48, sorry, on the 3080. My apologies. And the 1% lows were abysmal at that point as well. So now going on to Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, I'm not sure I'm really fond of this benchmark. There is a built-in benchmark into Metro Exodus, both enhanced and non-enhanced, but you have to go into the actual settings file of the game and find the benchmark launcher. So we can see here with the benchmark launcher that we're actually getting better 1% lows and 0.1% lows on the 6850, but we're getting worse FPS average on the 6850 versus 3080 at 1080p. This is with no DLSS because there's no FSR. So now going 1440p, we can see that we're getting higher FPS average on the 3080, but again, the 1% lows and 0.1% lows were higher by 100% on the 6850. And then we can go see going to 4K, there is a 114% difference for the 1% lows on the 3080 versus the 6850 again. However, the FPS averages was higher on this 3080. But then kicking on 3080 DLSS performance at 4K just because it has DLSS, so why not? We got a 32.1% increase on the FPS averages, and then we were still behind on this compared to the 6850. So there you have it. I will be revisiting this game along with Jedi Survivor and a handful of other games in the CPU bound dedicated video. Now going to Resident Evil 4 Remake, 1080p RT preset, no FSR. There's no DLSS in this game, so I just put no FSR because it's a highly optimized game in my opinion for like the lower, for any system honestly. So I just wanted to see what it would do in a light ray tracing scenario. So we can see here that there was a 10.9% difference with the 1% lows going from the 6850 to the 3080, and then a 29.5% difference going from the 3080 to the 6850. So that was 3080 being lower and 6850 being higher. We did see that the 6850 did get overall higher FPS average by 2. Keep in mind these are not like for like runs. I did try to keep it like for like, quick saved, reload the exact same quick save, took the exact same path. The enemies seemed to be doing the same pathing scenarios, and I was able to get grabbed at the end by that same guy consistently. So it's like a slice of gameplay, take it for what you will, but here's the FPS scenarios with that. So moving on to 1440p, again, no FSR because I still think that this is doable at 1440p. We can see that the 1% low swapped for the 6850 going to the 3080, 33.3% increase going from the 6850 to the 3080, although we did see the FPS average on the 6850 higher again by 7.8% this time. Now going to 4K ray tracing preset with no FSR, but then I turned on FSR balance for the last two results here, so forgive all my scribbles. So the 3080 versus 6850 with no FSR. we can see that we were getting a 96% decrease on the 1% lows going from the 3080 to the 6850. There was a 6.8% decrease on the overall FPS average going from the 3080 to the 6850. Now, turning on FSR balanced for the 3080 saw us get a 23.5% FPS increase from the 3080 with no FSR to the 3080 with FSR. Now, this is where it gets weird. Turning on FSR to balance with the 6850 saw worse overall FPS averages, but higher 1% and 0.1% lows. I'm not sure why this is the case. However, it did seem to be consistent because once I got that significant of a different result, especially with FSR turned on at 4K, you would expect it to be the other way around. I did this run again and again and again, and I was getting very, very similar results within like the 30s, mid 30s versus the higher or lower end 40s. However, the 1% lows and 0.1% lows were always consistently higher with FSR balance turned on the 6850. So I don't know like if there's something to do with FSR and then some sort of VRAM limitation maybe being hit with at 4K. I'm not sure. So honestly, I wouldn't really recommend I don't know. I wouldn't recommend either of these cards at 4K, but if you must, set it to FSR balanced at minimum, and you probably will have an okay time. Just temper your expectations with your graphics settings and your FPS target. Now, moving on to Red Dead Redemption 2, again, this is that final benchmark scenario of the robbery and then the horse chase. So we can see here that things are going to get a little bit weird. So the settings used were 1080p, favorite quality. So first means when you first check into the favorite quality preset box. And then I double checked and made sure that the settings were the exact same across. And as far as I could tell, they were. Now, if you haven't noticed already, some of the footage, or all the footage, going from the 3080 to the 6850, the 6850 looks a little bit like lighter or duller. That is just from the output of the capture card that I'm using. My apologies. So the capture card, I don't know. I've always noticed that when going from NVIDIA to AMD that they do have different color profiles, but it just appears to make itself more known in the footage that I'm using. So it's hard to compare like the actual image quality like for like. Even though these settings are the same, the results are kind of wildly different. There's no FSR, no DLSS involved here. So 3080 at 1080p, we're getting 88 FPS average, 18.5% difference between the 6850. But we did get a lot worse 1%, 0.1% lows, 56.6% for the 1% lows there. So now going 1440p, again, same settings, we were seeing a 5.4% increase from 3080 to 6850 on the FPS average. But we saw a 31.5% increase on the 0.1% lows going to the 3080 to the 6850. Now 4K, we did see finally the 3080 was taking its place, or in the 4K dominance, I guess, with the extra VRAM. There's a 23.1% increase in the FPS average, and the 0.1% lows and 1% lows were abysmal on the 6850, presumably due to VRAM limitations. Now going Sniper Elite 3, this is a weird one as well, more so for the AMD or the NVIDIA. So the NVIDIA at 1080p, exact same settings, ultra, no upscaling business. I think it's just straight DRS upscaling involved in this, but that's set to 100. So we saw an 85% difference between the 3080 and the 6850 at the overall FPS averages, and then even the 3080 for the 0.1% lows and 1% lows were well below 60, which is far below the playable limits in my opinion, especially at these higher frame rates. Now going to 6850, there's a 114% difference between the 1% lows. Going to 1440p, we're still seeing a massive increase, 97.9% difference on the FPS averages and 126.0% difference from going the 1% lows to the 3080 on the 6850. Again, completely unplayable in the 3080. Now going to 4K, same thing, 113% increase going from the 3080 to the 6850, 99.4% increase on the FPS averages. So this is just one of those games that, yes, it does favor AMD hardware, same as Red Dead Redemption, but when it's skewing this far out, something's a little weird. But I don't know. So I tested these all like the same way. I retested the 3080, retested it at various resolutions, and yeah, it was just the same result or close to the same result every time. Now, going to Starfield, this is my kind of custom benchmark run. It's just a little stretch run that I do in New Atlantis. So we can see at 3080 versus 6850. Again, this is going to be more of a test of the CPU, but we are seeing a 7.7% difference between the 6850 and 3080 for the FPS average. But we did get higher 1.1% lows at 35% difference between the 3080 and the 6850 being higher. Now going to 1440p, high preset, 42 versus 32, 27% difference. 29 versus 21 on the 1% lows there. So the 1% lows, 0.1% lows are kind of falling in line with the 6850 in a stair-stepping pattern now. Going to 4K, we're still seeing that kind of stair-stepping pattern. And again, this is more of a test on the CPU. But again, going to 4K, you are going to be taxing the GPU quite a bit at that point. So that's why you're not seeing quite a bit of a drop off from 1440p to 4K, like really, on the 3080. And to some degree on the 6850. But anyway, either experience is completely unplayable, honestly, in my opinion. But anyway, so moving past that, going to Tomb Raider, this is another benchmark run where I couldn't do the FPS 0.1% lows and 1% lows. So you'll see here that the purple is 1080p, 1440p is orange, and 4K is red. So we can see here that the 3080 going at 9.6%, and then the 6850 at 108. FPS, and then the 3080 for 1440p running at 100, 6850 at 81, and 4K running at 62 and 56. Now we can see here with the Wonderlands 1080p Ultra, no FSR, we are getting an FPS increase from the 3080 to the 6850, 9.2% increase. And then we are getting quite a big 107.6% increase from the 0.1% lows on the 3080 to the 6850. Now we can see at the 1440p Ultra, again, no FSR, we're getting 26% increase from the FPS averages to the 6850 to 3080, and 51% for the 1% lows. Now going 4K Ultra, no FSR, we can see that we're getting 26% increase on the averages, 14.8% difference for the 3080 going to 6850, and then 40-80% difference from the 3080 going to 6850. So even though we're getting higher overall FPS average, or much higher overall FPS average on 3080, we're getting much higher 1% lows and 0.1% lows on the 6850. Now, so getting into these performance differences that I've shown, this is how I've operated with my XG Mobile, how I've updated my XG Mobiles and gone back and forth between drivers and everything like that. So whether it's the correct way or incorrect way, I just figure treat it kind of like a GPU as you would with a regular PC. When you're switching from one to the other, disable the drivers and then or uninstall them and reinstall the new ones. The only difference is I don't run the Windows updates for the GPU and stuff. So if you go into DDU and go to your settings, you can disable force Windows updates. So what that seems to be doing is installing the Adrenaline control panel, or the AMD control software, the like gray and red kind of gridded control panel. So when I've been installing it the way I've been installing it, I've never had access to that. I've never seen the AMD control panel on my ROG Ally when I've installed my drivers this way. When I've installed the drivers, I guess the correct way of just kind of DDUing everything and then installing everything fresh on the ROG Ally itself, not with the GPU installed, plugged in or anything. And then just doing the updates like that and then plugging in the XG Mobile. That's when I'm able to get these difference in results of the 30 to 20 watt. And now I wasn't the one to figure this out. The one that pointed it out to me was Joe Pav in the ROG Ally Discord. He's a verified helper, verified member. I can't remember what the title that they give there in the ROG Ally Discord. I'm not affiliated with it in any way. I'm in it. And that's how we got into contact with each other. So in comparing our results with one another, we were seeing that in Rainbow Six and Light for Like settings, I believe it was Ultra settings, 100% render resolution, VSync off, HD texture pack installed, we were getting the same results with different methods, basically. So with my method, I was getting like the expected results, I guess you could say, of running it at 30 watts and getting like 244 plus FPS. And then when I ran it at 20 watt, I would get like 220 to 230, somewhere in that range. I would get a drop in FPS as you would expect. And because Rainbow Six is a very CPU heavy game, because you're pushing so many frames, you would feel that 20 or 10 watt difference, and you would feel that in performance, in my opinion, from dropping from 30 to 10 watt. But now in Joe Pav's testing, he was getting my results at 20 watt. So he was getting my 30 watt results at 20 watt, and then his 30 watt results were a little bit worse, but not quite as drastic as mine were. But 30 watt for him mainly was very inconsistent. So that's when I'm talking about like the frame time pacing and all that. So the rendering time and CPU and GPU rendering time it was very inconsistent. And that was shown in the charts that he had sent me over that he was testing. So the way that he had everything installed is he had it installed the conventional way. So he had access to the AMD control panel. He could see all of the AMD RSR and all those settings and everything with that. I've never had access to this because this is how I've installed my drivers, just through the XG Mobile. So even when he was able to DDU his drivers and he checked off the don't install Windows updates as well, he was reinstalling it the same way I was reinstalling them, except the AMD control panel was able to install, or the AMD Adrenalin software was able to install as well on his end, but it wasn't able to install on my end, presumably through the Windows updates. Now, this was a bug in the past as well, for, if you remember, the 100 watt bug on the 6850, where I believe it was one of the Windows updates or one of the AMD driver updates was causing the bug issue and not letting the 6850 boost up to 165 watts. So with all that being said, you can take these performance results for what they are. I've tested the games and the GPUs the exact same way. I've DDU'd and reinstalled the exact same way, and this is how I've gotten my test results. This is how I've gotten my test results in the past as well. Whether or not it's the correct way, I would say everything on my end is working as expected or as intended or as I believe it would be working normally. And having the 3080 compared to the 6850 and seeing the power profile differences, they are different in some respect because the 3080 doesn't typically hit max power usage unless you're using some of the Tensor RT cores. But with the 6850, you're able to hit the max wattage quite often. But with Joe Pav's experience running at 30 watt, he was getting inconsistent wattage as well. So he was not hitting that 165 watt consistently in Diablo 4 as well as Rainbow Six. But then when he kicked it down to 20 watt, he was able to hit those higher FPS averages, and more importantly, the frame time and the 1% lows, 0.1% lows were smoothed out. So it was a much smoother experience, and his GPU was getting maxed out at 165 watts, as you would expect it to be at those graphic settings and resolutions and everything. Now, this is still very early as to whether this is an issue or how the issue is presenting itself. I don't know. The only thing that I can find in common is that people, or when I'm able to recreate the issue, is we have the Windows Store updates installed and have the AMD control panel installed. So by installing it with display driver on installer and not allowing Windows to update, it seems as though I'm able to bypass the bug and it seems to work as intended, but that still doesn't explain why Joe Pav is getting the same results that I'm getting at 30 watt that he's getting at 20 watt when installed his way. So that's the part where there's the disconnect that just doesn't make sense. Because you would assume that more power equals more better for the CPU. And especially with I'm running CPU boost off and everything, so you want the CPU running as if it's a regular CPU in a system, because you have an external graphics card hooked up to it, so you want it to have its max power, ideally, running in a high performance scenario. So why it's running similar at 20 watt versus 30 watt on Joe Pav's system and in the kind of like recreated system, I don't know. So for now, if you have the 6850, the fix or the workaround, I guess, is to either set your wattage to 20 watts and enjoy the savings of the power and heat and everything, or go the workaround kind of way that I install my drivers. I'm not saying it's the conventional or easy or best way, but it's just how I've been doing it and how I've always got my testing results. And you can do it that way, and then it seems to work as intended, or as you would expect normally, at worse performance at 20 watt and better performance at 30 watt. So this is already kind of a lot more than I wanted to talk about it. Like, it's obviously a big issue, but this is kind of also why things are kind of like down to the last minute and not having the videos out in time and everything, because this was very recent, even like just as I was getting the results and everything put together near the tail end of them. So with all that being said, what I can say in the preliminary video results of all this, the 3080 is a hell of a lot more consistent. I've never had to worry about the 68 or the 3080, sorry, like I have with the 6850. The 6850, you have to worry about this bug or that bug or this performance bug and that performance bug, whether it's caused by AMD or ASUS or whatever, the drivers, the GPU drivers, who knows. But all I can say is that with the 3080, since I've had it in my system with the ROG Ally as well as the Flow X16 that my wife has, performance has just been consistent. I plug it in, I do install the drivers like I normally would, and then it just works. I have no problems with it. I expect that the 4090 was working similar as well, although I don't have the 4090 on hand at all to verify that. Up until the latest ASUS Armory Crate SE update, I was still having connection issues with the 6850 of it just not connecting and then deactivating and then looping, and with the activating and deactivating bug and then not putting out a source signal. So the latest ASUS Armory Crate update seems to have fixed that, but then now it seems that there's this other issue. So was it brought on with the ASUS Armory Crate update, or was it not? Honestly, I don't know, and at this point, I just want to get this part of the video out so you can see some sort of performance numbers, and then in the second part of the video, I'm going to be comparing the GPUs attached to the Flow X16. So that's with the 13900H processor from the Intel side. So much more powerful, much more capable processor. And it's a laptop processor versus a mobile APU. So yeah, that's kind of where this direction of the video is going. The second part of the video is going to be more investigating into 20 watt versus 30 watt, as well as testing on the Flow to see if in GPU bound scenarios, if we're getting similar results. So trying to take the CPU out of the equation and then putting the CPU back into the equation and see how much performance we're losing out on by having it attached to the ROG Ally. Because for certain games like Star Wars, Starfield especially, they are heavily CPU bound, so you're going to be getting much better performance on the Flow X16 with the 13900 than you would be on the ROG Ally with the Z1 Extreme. But anyway, so that's kind of the general flow, and then the final video, whether I get 4 or 3 videos in this series, hopefully 3, but it might stretch out to 4 depending on how things can develop. That will be how the flow of the videos go. The ending video will be kind of synopsis or summary of everything. So anyway, so, with all that being said, as always, huge shout out to my channel members, Roy Wayne, Darkstar, Amoa, Rico1217, Joey VR, and Root Access. You guys are truly amazing. It's been 2 long months now with most of you and almost a month with Root Access, and honestly, that you guys have stuck around even for a month is beyond me. So thank you very much for sticking it out. I'm apologizing in advance that the content has gotten like a little bit light. I'm going to finish up this series, and then I'm going to be doing a Steam Deck temperature deep dive in the future. Like this will be the next video series I'm going to be doing. I'm not accepting any like other kind of like sponsorship or like product offers or anything like that. In the meantime, I'm going to get this next one done for the Steam Deck thermals, especially now that undervolting is back out with the Steam Deck. So, with all that being said, thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far, I appreciate it. Like it, dislike it, share it, don't care. Here's my performance numbers, here's my piece. Hopefully we can get to the bottom of this bug on the 6850, and I'll be revisiting it in the second video. So, as always, I hope you all have a great day.